Right. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. To all of those here at Haymarket House and those of you joining us on YouTube. My name is Carlos, and I'm part of the team at Haymarket Books. I wanted to welcome you to the event tonight, Degrowth Communism with Kōhei Saitō, in conversation with Eric Wallenberg. We'll say a little bit more about our program tonight. But first, I just wanted to welcome everybody by acknowledging that Haymarket House events that take place happen in the occupied lands of the Council of the Three Fires, Ojibwe, Arawa, and Potawatomi, the indigenous keepers of the land, who through acts of genocide, deceit, and dispossession were forcibly removed from the founding of the city of Chicago in the state of Illinois. It's also worth recognizing that genocide is not just a thing that we read about in history books. And with that in mind, we want to say that we stand in solidarity with everyone in Gaza and Palestine fighting against colonialism and a Zionist project of genocide. We're living in dark times, but coming together as a community with events like tonight, talking about a better future, I think is exactly what we need to do more of. So now to introduce our speakers, Eric Wallenberg is an editor at Science for the People. We'll have some issues for sale after the event. He's also a worker owner at Pilsen Community Books, who are helping us organize tonight. So please give it up for our friends at PCB. And of course, we have Kōhei Saitō. So Kōhei is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Tokyo. He received his PhD in philosophy from Humboldt Universität zu Berlin in 2016. He was awarded the 2018 Isaac Deutscher Memorial Prize, the most prestigious academic award for Marx studies, making Saitō the youngest recipient. In 2020, the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science awarded him the highly prestigious JSPS Prize. The top 25 scholars, only a few in humanities and social sciences, in the entire country under the age of 45. In 2021, Slow Down, which is the book that we'll be discussing tonight, received the Best Asian Books of the Year prize from the Asia. So thank you so much for joining us, and I will kick it over to our speakers.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Sorry for being a little late. I'm staying at the U Chicago, and then I thought it was like Chicago, right? So it's very close, but it was actually kind of far. It took more than like 80 minutes. So anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm very excited to share my book, which was actually published a couple of years ago, so it's not like super new, but I think the key theses are still very valid, and I think it's even more important in the age of war, ecological breakdown, and so on. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight in this book is, of course, degrowth communism, and basically, if you are a socialist, you must care more about the environment, and if you do that, you become degrowth, right? And then on the other hand, if you are more interested in ecological movements and you are supportive of the idea of degrowth, it's very important to endorse also the idea of socialism or communism and learning from Marx's tradition. And I hope that some of the conversation today clarify why degrowth communism is important and why it's not about austerity and the green dictatorship. Rather, it's a new political imaginary that we direly need in the age of a polycrisis. But yeah, let's begin. Thank you, Eric, for joining today.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. This is great. We're really happy to have you here. Happy you made it on our less than exciting trains in this country. So at least you made it, right? That's the important.
Yeah, I didn't want to come with Uber, right? So
you got to make it on train, even though they're not great here. So I was just hoping you might start by laying out, just so we can all get on the same page, where you start the book, sort of how you lay out the ecological crisis as you see it today. In particular, I think it's worth noting a couple of phrases you use, a couple of ideas you use that I think are really valuable for us to think about. In particular, you talk about the imperial mode of living, which I think is a useful way to think about the divide between rich and poor, the divide between North and South. But if you can sort of talk a little bit about that and a little bit about ecological imperialism, I think with the the world and the state it's in today, it's worth thinking about that concept a little as well.
Okay, so maybe I can start with some little background of this book because I think people are curious because this book became very big bestseller in Japan, selling like more than 500,000 copies because this is a book about degrowth and communism. They both are very negative, and people usually don't care about those things, but it somehow became very popular in Japan. And that was because it was, I think, partly because this book was published during the pandemic, and it was a moment of crisis of life, obviously, but also the crisis of capitalism. And it really made two contradictions of capitalism very visible to everyone. So, one is obviously economic inequality, essential workers, always shortage of people, exposed to the risk of virus, and also, however, getting very low paid, long hour working. And so, like these problems, but they are essential, but still they are really marginalized, precarious, and so on. But on the other hand, those people who work in the financial industries and so on, I mean, they even accumulated the wealth in the middle of pandemic when 99% of people are suffering from losing jobs, getting out of kicked out from the houses and so on. And the other crisis was obviously the ecological crisis. The virus wouldn't have come without massive deforestation, agribusiness, and this globalized economy, people moving and commodity moving around all over the world by fossil fuel. And this is obviously accelerating ecological crisis by obviously the climate crisis too. So that was also the moment these two contradictions became very obvious in Japan. And people also had some opportunity to reflect on their own way of living, which I characterized as the imperial mode of living using a concept by Marx and Ulrich Bland, two German sociologists. That's basically, our affluent life in the global north, in Japan, in the US, in European countries, is at the cost of people's life and the environment somewhere else, especially in the global south. And, we have like cheap fashion, cheap food, cheap meat, cheap flights, and all those things are, very intensive or in terms of usage of energy and resources. However, we often do not have to think about it. We just buy them because they're cheap and tasty and, they make our life very comfortable. But it's simply because many ecological impacts and the problem of exploitation are kind of shifted to somewhere else. It's hidden from us. And that's why we didn't have to face the reality of what's going on. However, really in the moment of the pandemic, even we could no longer really ignore those negative tendencies and the distractions and the capitalism. So we had to think more about critically whether this way of life could go on and, if it's even better because we actually slow down in the middle of pandemic, and then that was also a way of spending more time with family, with your friends, not necessarily with friends, but different way of working from home, and that really shortened the commute time, and that so that really created some atmosphere of thinking about different ways of life. And then my book suggested, but if you really want another way of life, capitalism must be challenged. It is not simply about a little more redistribution of wealth, spending a little more money for hospitals or public transportation or whatsoever. We really need to challenge the absolute imperative of growth under capitalism, because capitalism is about profit making, right? If capitalism really made it clear, especially during the pandemic, that it only cares about making profit. It doesn't produce what is necessary for many people when these goods or commodities are not profitable. So in the moment of crisis, and this crisis will be worse and worse because climate crisis will continue to getting worse and worse. If this system only cares about profit, the economic inequality will grow, environmental damages will not be mitigated because these things are often not profitable now. So really, we need to have a very different conception of what our economy is centered upon. And I argue that this cannot be profit anymore. It must be based on use values, essential services and goods. And then we really need to kind of challenge this mode of thinking under capitalism.
Thanks for that. And before we get in, I want to talk a lot more about production and how you really frame the book around. We have to rethink at the level of production, not just sort of consumption, which I think is really helpful. But before we get there, the one other thing I think would be helpful to lay out for everyone who hasn't read the book yet is the four possible futures you talk about when we think about some of the options in front of us as we live in this moment of intersecting crises, both economic and ecological, and then the political crises we face. And so I wonder if you might just say a little something about this idea of stronger state power versus less state power, and do we meet the challenges of the ecological crisis?
Yes, yeah, I broadly kind of described four different kinds of the future. If we continue today's neoliberal capitalist way of life, the inequality in the polycrisis will continue to grow. The ecological, the climate crisis will increase the number of abnormal weathers and wildfires and drought, and leading to water shortage, food shortage, accelerating inflation, which also increases the economic inequality. But all those shortages could also increase the geopolitical tension, which is also reinforced by climate refugees to come from Africa and Latin America and so on. And they will lead to the kind of the rise of more xenophobic right-wing populism. So we will probably have the slower growth because of the inflation, so the crisis of capital accumulation, but the crisis of ecology, and then the crisis of democracy. So these are very tightly connected in the age of polycrisis. But the problem is what we learned from, as I pointed out, what we learned in the middle of pandemic is in the middle of crisis, some people under capitalism even accumulate more wealth using those crises. So it is likely that if we everything to the market, some people will be even richer. At the same time, many people will be more vulnerable to various kinds of economic and other kinds of risks. So this is the kind of the very bad neoliberal future, which I kind of call climate fascism, which is basically characterized by very massive wealth inequality. When some people just live in a comfortable way, but many people, on a global scale especially, are exposed to the risks, which really requires some kind of strong political leaders, maybe like Donald Trump in the US, who kind of legitimizes this kind of sovereignty, which I call climate leviathan, following Joel Wainwright and Geoff Mann. And probably, but this is not something that can be stabilized in terms of sovereignty. So I think the more and more people kind of rebelling against this situation, more refugees will come, and then this will be a kind of out of control, which I characterize as climate barbarism. Like this is really the situation of chaos. So this is something that we obviously do not want to have. And then the other political choice would be really demanding surveillance, kind of strong, even authoritarian government that really controls and regulates and mitigate climate crisis and the market and so on. So this is a one more socialist path, but this is very top-down kind of way of government, which I characterize as climate Maoism. So this is like Chinese government, socialism, some kind of socialism is implemented, but a lot of security, surveillance, and so monitoring. And that's like no freedom, but we kind of demand for the sake of avoiding barbarism. And all these three choices are not obviously attractive, right? So my alternative, and the only alternative, is the one that tries to secure equality, justice, and sustainability. And this is degrowth communism. Why degrowth communism? Because one is that degrowth basically demands that we abandon the usage of GDP as the measure of progress, because GDP could be, for example, increased by military spending, by destroying and killing people, but it can also be increased by privatizing hospitals, waters, and electricity, and everything can be commodified for the sake of GDP, but it really decreasing our well-being. So that's bad. But also, GDP is about profit making. So capitalism is basically investing for the sake of reinvesting those profits again and again. So capitalism is a system of constant expansion and then characterized by constant growth of GDP. But again, in the age of crisis, we need to pay more attention to what is necessary and what is important for everyone, not what is profitable. So degrowth basically demands, in the second way, demands that we distinguish what is necessary and unnecessary. And first, abandoning those kinds of unnecessary goods. My favorite example is obviously private jets. These are the things that we never use. So why don't we just abandon? So, it really doesn't matter. But then for some people, it's like really tiny percentage of people that are really using those things for the sake of comfortable, whatever, life or prestige or whatsoever. So the degrowth is about two things. As I said, it's about challenging GDP and then distinguishing what is necessary and unnecessary. And then in a society in which we invest more in those sustainable and essential goods and services, we need to share more, because simply increasing technology is not enough. We cannot simply have electric vehicles for everyone. If everyone wants to have like some kind of these big US cars, even if they are electrified, they are not sustainable. So that simply increases or like guarantees the continuation of the imperial mode of living. That's why those policies of Green New Deal in the US, investing in electric vehicles, renewable energies, can be very appealing for many people because it creates more jobs, higher wages, and so on and so on. Of course, these are attractive and important, but if we just simply want to continue the current way of living, it will be just simply reintroducing another kind of ecological imperialism, because electric vehicles and other things are quite resource and energy intensive, right? So there will be more of resource mining, extraction, coming mainly from the global south, which is accompanied by environmental destruction of the life of the indigenous people, and so on and so on. So if we really want to care about climate justice on a global scale and a sustainable life for everyone, the imperial mode of living must be challenged. That means also that we also have to challenge this kind of excessive way of living too. Then we need to share more. We need to invest in more of public transportation, maybe, kind of more making some kind of small 15-minute small cities or something like that. There are many ways, and I'm not going into details, but basic idea is degrowth socialism or degrowth communism is creating new way of abundance, not by increasing technologies and then producing more green commodities, but by sharing, decommodifying what is essential. So this is the creation of the commons. So the society based on commons is what I call communism. So degrowth communism is something that is not so scary. It is rather more kind of attractive for many people and even sympathetic with socialist politics.
Thanks. All right. So I think what you do that's different than what we've seen with other people writing about degrowth is to put forward this idea of degrowth communism, to give it a name, and then to try to give it some broad outlines, but also some particulars. And if you'll bear with me, if I might read from the book, just one portion here that I think is useful for people who haven't read the book yet. You say it's crucial to change the nature of labor to save the environment. To put it more provocatively, Marx believed that revolutionizing modes of distribution and consumption, transforming the political system, and changing people's values are all secondary concerns. Conventional wisdom misunderstands communism as consisting of banning private property and replacing it with nationalization. But the fact is that even modes of ownership aren't the real problem. The most crucial thing, above all else, is the revolutionary transformation of labor and production. This is the main difference between the form of degrowth proposed by this book and that of earlier degrowth theorists who studiously avoided engaging with Marxism and workers' movements and thus failed to address the dimension of labor in their arguments. And to me, this gets to the thrust of where I think we need to go, where the rubber meets the road, where we actually need to talk about how do we change the system? Is it about consumption, or is it about this question of production and who has power to determine what we're producing? And so I was hoping you might say something about what that looks like to you. You give some examples around Detroit and around Barcelona, and I can raise some more of those as we go on, but I hope you might say something here about the question of production.
Oh yeah, because what I wanted to highlight is basically that when people hear the terms like socialism, people often associate, I think it's the same in the US, it's associated with like Soviet Union, China, and it's like, Communist Party, really top down, no freedom of speech and so on, and then they kind of nationalize everything. But this nationalization is not characterized by democratic control of the means of production by workers. So this is really nothing. My claim is basically this Soviet-style socialism has nothing to do with socialism in Marx's sense, because Marx was actually more interested. Here is Peter Hudis, by the way, who is also working on this issue of association. Marx often calls the future society the associated mode of production. So it is not top-down, everything state-owned, but rather it is more kind of bottom-up, decentralized control of the means of production by workers. So, one thing is that this view of changing the image of socialism or communism is very important, because otherwise we simply end up demanding again strong government, please reinvest or take more tax from the rich people and simply invest in car industries to create more jobs. And that's more like social democratic politics that are still characterized by the constant growth and, thinking only about the well-being of the working class. It's very male dominant, that kind of thing must be challenged, because what's missing, what the problem is, even if we somehow establish democratic control of means of production, what happens if those workers with today's capitalist values decided to invest more in geoengineering, nuclear fusion, and just like produce more and more for the sake of private jets for everyone or something like that? I mean, that's not the really progressive politics, right? I think that democratic socialism, in this sense, must be accompanied or supplemented with the vision of degrowth. Otherwise, socialist politics can simply be about private jets for everyone, really. And then this is a debate that's actually taking place today. I have some debates with people in Jacobin, for example, and some people in the left are quite optimistic about those dream technologies like nuclear fusion, electrification of air flights, and new green agriculture and so on and so on. I'm not denying the necessity of electrifying many things, including cars, but that doesn't mean that we can simply, have more cars if they are electrified. Rather, what I advocate is basically the necessity of investing in green technologies. This is the socialist part. We need to plan. We cannot simply count on the profit and market. So we need to socialize things. But at the same time, it is also necessary to reduce the number of cars by, for example, sharing cars or by investing more in public transportations and by preparing bike lanes and so on. And these are some examples that is already implemented in cities like Barcelona and Paris. And so it's not like a dream utopian thing. It is a concrete proposal that actually we can aim after. But my point is basically simply socialism is not enough. It always, I think today, must be degrowth, because otherwise the value of working class cannot be simply, green. But that doesn't mean I want to highlight this. That doesn't mean degrowth is not about going back to nature, right? So you can keep probably iPhones, but with the right to repair, right? And then more, the transparency of privacy, and of course more pressure to the kind of how the Apple treat workers and so on. But it's not really about going to some kind of lake or garden, grow organic vegetables and so on. So, but you see the thing, right? And it's not about those two extremes. It's only about going back to nature, pristine kind of thing. But it's also not about those dream technologies that can simply the continuation of today's way of living, because I think this really reinforces the imperial mode of living over the long run. So I'm suggesting the third path, and then this is a path that only the alliance of environmentalism and socialism can open up. And this is a mutual learning process, and this is also good for working class too. Degrowth is not about austerity, by the way. It is the creation of new abundance by decommodifying education, medical cares, public transportation, and maybe even free internet and so on. We work too many hours because we have to pay bills and rent and so on. But the problem is with today's high productive forces, we produce so many things. If everyone works like 40, 50 hours every week, right? But then what companies do? They do advertisements, model changes, excessive sales. And this is also bad for the consumers. They never become happy. And also bad for environment too. A lot of waste of resources and energies and so on. So by decommodifying many goods, you are kind of liberated from the constant pressure to work and earn money for the sake of paying bills. Rather, you get more security and you can devote your time. You get free disposable time, if I use Marx's expression. Free disposable time for, I don't know, whatever you like, learning new languages, reading books, and communal organization, and doing sports, or, these are the things that we actually want to do in your life. Not simply buying new things all the time, or just working at the cost of time with friends and family. And so this decommodification is not that radical. It is it's happening in the many Scandinavian countries, but this can be utilized to really transform our way of life and expand kind of non-capitalist sphere within capitalism. And this is a kind of non-reformist reform that Andre Gortz characterized. And I basically support this direction. Andre Gortz is a philosopher in France who coined the term décroissance, so degrowth, in the 70s. And this tradition is something that we can still learn. And by reviving that tradition, I think we can have this socialist, eco-socialist degrowth or degrowth communism back to the agenda of the left-wing politics.
Thanks. I think in a room here in Chicago, where I think all of that is very relatable, that I think hopefully we'll find out in the discussion makes a lot of sense to people. But I'm curious too that your choice of calling this degrowth communism doesn't quite fit on the other end, which is that there's a whole section of the world who lives not like people in general live in Chicago, and actually need quite a lot more, need more access. And so I hope you might just talk a little bit about this idea, right? Because it's not just degrowth communism across the board. Part of, I think, what you talk about in the book, if I got it right, is Marx doesn't actually use that phrase. What you're drawing on is this idea of steady state economies, or steady state economies from earlier pre-capitalist formations where there was general abundance or people's needs were met, but things stayed stable. It wasn't a growth economy. It wasn't constant new inputs and new outputs. And so I was hoping you might say something about kind of both of those questions, what we say about the rest of the world, right? Many other parts of the world. And I guess I might also want to ask you on this a little bit. It's not just a divide between the so-called North and South, or the developed and underdeveloped world, but there is real class differences and real economic differences within these societies, right? That in the neighborhood we're sitting in now is quite different than the west side of Chicago, or areas where people have less access to healthcare, et cetera, education, et cetera. So if you might just say something about this idea of degrowth is not, we don't just mean degrowth, you mean more than that.
So first of all, degrowth is not about going back to nature, and it's about creation of new kind of abundance, which I call communal luxury, following Christian Ross, or recently people call it public luxury, and that's kind of the very different non-consumptionist type of abundance, and it's a radical abundance that we can enjoy without really constantly consuming new commodities and constantly consuming new energy and resources. But that doesn't simply mean that everyone should be poor, and especially I explicitly acknowledge here that the global south, people who do not have access to water, electricity, and food and so on, education, there are still so many people like that. And then those countries and areas need, obviously, more investment in infrastructure and so on. So they will require growth, right? But in countries like US, Japan, the further investment for the sake of selling more goods in favor of capitalist accumulation is not making people happier. It can even decrease people's well-being and damage environment. So that's one thing. But I prefer to use not developed and underdeveloped countries. Rather, I use global north and south, because global south can be found in a single country, like Japan. That's I think the one reason why I came to endorse degrowth politics, because I pay more attention to the existence of global south within Japan, which means that life in Tokyo, where I'm from, is realizing its imperial mode of living at the cost of somewhere else within Japan. One is obviously Okinawa. Okinawa is basically occupied by U.S. military bases. So, that is concentrated there. That's why Tokyo can spend more spaces and, resources in other capitalist activities, for example. But people in Okinawa cannot develop their own industries and so on. Then they are so much dependent on tourist industries. And so that's one inequality. The other one that I really regretted is the one in Fukushima, the nuclear power disaster in 2011, and I regretted that I didn't spend enough time and I didn't think enough about anti-nuclear movements before when I was like high school and undergraduate student. There was always nuclear power plants everywhere. It was like in Japan, like 55 nuclear power plants. But that, especially the ones in Fukushima, generated electricity to Tokyo, for Tokyo. They didn't use all the electricity in Fukushima. People there didn't use it. So the risk was marginalized, and all the costs and damages after the earthquake is also shifted to the people in Fukushima. And then Tokyo's people almost forget about Fukushima disaster that is continuing even today. So I think looking at that kind of dynamics of shifting the contradiction, I came to recognize that simply counting on those dream technologies, the green ones or whatsoever, is not enough. It could simply hide or prevent us from, or me from recognizing the imperial mode of living, and really it prevents me from looking for more just alternative. And that's how I came to pay more attention to ecological questions and the issue of environmental justice in the, like 10 years ago. And that's how I gradually became to endorse degrowth idea. But as a Marxist researcher, I had some difficulty because Marxism or socialism is often characterized by more kind of techno-optimistic or productivist, which we usually use, productivist or Promethean view of technology and productive forces. So I understand that even today, some socialists are like that, especially in the US. But actually looking at, especially the late Marx, this is one part which I want to highlight. As a Marxist scholar, I look at his unpublished notebooks, and they are consisting of two parts. One is notebooks on natural sciences. Why? Because he was really concerned about metabolic rifts, the ecological contradictions under capitalism. So he studied chemistry, geology, and botanics and so on, and then issues of soil exhaustion of the soil, excessive deforestation, extinction of species, and that kind of issues were already present in the 19th century. So he really eagerly studied. The other thing that was also important in today's context is that he extensively studied non-Western pre-capitalist societies, about which Kevin Anderson, who is a professor in California, wrote a great book, Marx at the Margins. I can also highly recommend. But basically, what I wanted to do with this book and then the other book, Marx in the Anthropocene, is why Marx studied natural sciences and non-Western pre-capitalist society at the same time. They must be somehow interconnected. They are related somehow. And my hypothesis, I discuss more in detail in my books, but put it very short. Basically, Marx was trying to learn from non-Western societies how they organized their own metabolic interaction with the environment. And those societies was obviously stationary state, but people are often quite equal, David Graeber, that kind of thing, the kind of primitive communism. But at the same time, Marx came to recognize these society, primitive communes were quite sustainable, lasted for many, many years, in some cases, thousands of years, right? And that means that equality, social equality, economic equality, and sustainability are both sides of the same coin. They're related. And then he came to recognize also that capitalist technologies are often developed for the sake of exploiting more from the workers and extracting more from nature. So these technologies are not necessarily progressive. They are the means of domination and subjugation. Can we use those technologies in a democratic way for the sake of people and the environment in socialism? So geoengineering can be all of a sudden democratic technology in socialism? I do not think so. So he started to questioning this kind of optimistic idea. Once socialism is established, all those technology we can use and then for the better purposes, not for the sake of, enriching capitalism and so on. He really started questioning his earlier view of history, characterized by this progressive development of productive forces and so on. Then he studied non-Western societies and came to recognize equality, sustainability, all related together. That's the moment when he said in the 1881 in his letter to Vera Zasulich, the Russian revolutionary, asking whether Russian communes must be destroyed for the sake of introducing capitalism in Russia. Marx said no. Russian communes can be the starting point of revolution. And not just that, he added the crisis of capitalism in Western countries can only be overcome when the Western societies return to those higher stages of archaic communes, like a higher stage of those primitive communes. So he said the Western society needs to return to non-Western societies, or it means that Western societies need to learn from non-Western societies, non-Western values, non-Western way of living, non-Western ways of production, and non-Western things, right? So that's really the moment Marx abandoned his Eurocentric productivist vision. It's 1881. He died in 1883. So it's really the last moment of his life when he came to endorse this kind of idea of degrowth. And then, of course, he was always communist, so he became finally degrowth communist.
Excellent. Love it. So I think we have a big crowd here, and I think we have a crowd online on the live stream. So I do want to open it up to questions. I'm going to ask you more while people get their thoughts together, think about what you want to ask in terms of what Kōhei has laid out here already. But if I can have you maybe say one more word before we open it up to questions, I would be remiss if I didn't, where you start the English preface, the preface to the English edition, you start with cooperatives. And as a fellow worker owner at Pilsen Community Books, a worker cooperative, I was hoping you might say a little bit about how you see cooperatives fitting into how we get there, as well as some of the other examples you use. So you talk about the fearless cities, Barcelona being one of the big ones, the idea of municipalism. So there's lots of different ways, lots of different actors and sites of contestation that you point to as possible ways to get us there. And I'm hoping you might just say something about what you see as a sort of multi-pronged way of getting there, still an exploration, the limits or benefits of particular types of these resistance movements.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not, in my book, I'm not a Leninist, so I don't advocate for kind of the, massive kind of revolution that really takes over the powers of the state and so on. And I'm not so in a sense, I'm not like Andreas Malm, if you're familiar with him. He's a very radical and he's great, but it's just a way of sort of reviving the socialist ideas. It's necessary, especially in the countries like Japan, where people are very conservative. It was necessary to sort of employ different kinds of concepts and language, and you can criticize me for that. But my point is basically one is I already explained the necessity of decommodification, and the decommodification of education, medical care, public transportation. These are things that we can obviously introduce within capitalism, but that doesn't mean the full development of these of the decommodification is possible under capitalism, and it really entails some moment of non-capitalist struggle because it, as I said, liberates us to some extent from the constant pressure to work, and it mitigates our dependence on commodity, money, and capital and the market and so on. So it prepares some conditions for more radical ways of activities, and it really transforms the way of thinking for many people. This is one thing that I came to recognize when I studied in Germany. Before that, I went to Wesleyan University in the U.S. and then all my friends studied, econ, and they became like investment bankers, and they are like Asian friends from those countries. So they are really passionate about getting jobs, and then other friends too. They are having loans, so they have to work at least a couple years to pay back those loans. And so really, it was important for them to finish this study in 4 years and get a job and so on and so on. But if you go to Germany, it's different. The university is free, so some of the friends I met was doing PhD for 20 years. So they're like, when do you finish your masterpiece? But that's like a very different way of living, because it doesn't really matter. They get, students get various kinds of support, and education is free, and there was also the rent control, and the building was not that expensive compared to now. So that really it was no strong pressure to finish in 4 years, and also they don't have to look for those jobs in financial industries. They can just do environmental activities, or they can start cooperatives, and it really creates a different kind of dynamism in society by decommodifying certain things. So we cannot underestimate. But other things, for example, it is possible to talk more about reducing working hours, because even in Marx's time, basically Marx was advocating for 8 hours per day, and that was already introduced partially in the US at the time. So that was Marx's source of inspiration. And after 150 years, we are still using this system. And, with those technologies, why are we working so long? And we can change this. Why don't we reduce the number of hours to 30 hours maybe first? And that's not very radical, but at the same time, again, it creates new conditions for different kind of values. But because maybe people spend more in political activities and so on, unionism and so on. And the society needs to pay more attention to, the essential workers. It's not those bullshit jobs that are more important than essential workers. And I think so. Like it's really shifting our society to focus more on what is essential and what is not. It's not about what is profitable. And then the final thing is, yes, I argue in my book that installing cooperatives, because this is partly because that law of establishing cooperatives, workers' cooperatives, was finally introduced in Japan a couple of years ago. So that was really the moment when Japanese society also talked about these possibilities of workers' cooperatives. And then, I also visited Baltimore, Red Emma here. These are like socialist cooperatives in the US and in European countries. Mondragon is obviously the most famous one. But these are also the ways that workers can democratically own. This is a really representative, the associated mode of production. We also, of course, have difficulties with cooperatives, but it also means that there are many things that we can do within capitalism. And also, it's not necessary all the time that we take over the state power, because in cities like Barcelona and in Spain, but also in Berlin, Paris, and those European cities are implementing more progressive policies, like reducing the cars and higher parking costs for bigger cars, and also banning short distance domestic flight and closing supermarkets and department store on Sundays, regulating advertisement in the public spheres. And these are the things that already European cities are installing or thinking about installing soon. And they will also change how people spend Sundays. Right? In Japan, or everyone goes to shopping malls and consume more. In Germany, all things are closed, so they just spend more time at cafe, do demonstration. It's like really simplified examples, but you can imagine like these new way of living can be started on the city level, which is now getting bigger and bigger international as a movement of municipalism. Started by Fearless City in Barcelona. And so these are the things that also the American cities can learn. And then Detroit is also doing something like that, and the gardening and that. So yeah, my point is basically the possibilities are already here because yeah, communism in my sense, is already in capitalism. Capitalism is often dependent on people's mutual aid and altruistic behavior and communal ties to make profit, right? But that's bad. But at the same time, communism is always there. So why don't we try to expand it to wider and wider sphere? And then maybe the society based on the commons, in a sense of in that sense, could be realized in coming decades or so.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. Excellent. So why don't we see if we have a couple of questions in the audience? Take a couple at once, and depending on the question, maybe. Okay. Okay, good. So in the back, in the orange hat.
I'm wondering what space there is for indigenous epistemologies in this idea of degrowth communism, and I'm thinking also about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and some of the ideas of sharing and sustainability and equality, like this the first democracy kind of established. Just thinking about where indigenous, because you're mentioning so many European cities, and I'm just thinking, how does this apply to indigenous communities? And also, some of the ideas that you share, I also see a lot in indigenous epistemologies, and I wonder if your approach can be involved. One more?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the most original contributions that you made, I think, theoretically, not just in this book, but in your earlier one, was what you mentioned before, is this a notion that Marx in 1881, in the Letters to Sasulich, is seeing the West has to, the future of the West in any kind of socialist transformation will be returning on a higher level to the pre-capitalist communal forms. And of course, there's not a growth dynamic within those pre-capitalist forms, so that implies a kind of degrowth communism. I don't want to complicate the issue with scholarly minutia, but in the same year, of course, as you well know, he writes with Engels the preface to the 1881 edition, of the Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, in which he also states that Russia could get conceivably to socialism without going through capitalistic industrialization. But he also makes that point that such a transition would depend upon technological aid from the capitalist West. So do you see these 2 points as complementary or contradictory? I know there are some that argue, well, maybe it's Engels and not Marx that wrote that preface. Just conceptually, do you think that they're complementary? And because it kind of gets to issues that were raised today about what about places in the global South that are so in need of development, but of a different type of development.
Exactly. So I think these two questions are actually related because Marx was basically studying those non-Western societies and then how do we connect or how do we learn from that kind of engagement today if we also want to think about the relationship of the global North and South, but as well as how do we compensate and reparation of the indigenous communities and knowledge and so on. So let me start with the second question. And basically, Yes, I don't think these are contradictory remarks. Rather, they are complementary because what I also said in today's conversation is basically degrowth is not about going back to nature, right? So it's we need new technologies that are already developed in capitalism to decarbonize our society. So that is also applicable to the global south. The global south really needs to install renewable energy, solar panels, wind turbines, and they also need to have access to medical cares using those technologies, mainly today developed in capitalist countries and even monopolized. But so we need to dismantle that kind of monopoly and more fair distribution and so on. But that they are not the negation of those technologies. So basically, I think that is also partly why Marx also said in the letter this expression higher stage, right? So even if the Western societies return to pre- pre-capitalist communes, it's the higher stage of those communes, right? So it's in some sense retaining those technologies and developments on the one hand. And also he recognized, obviously, after studying those pre-capitalist societies, that there are many limitations in those pre-capitalist societies. Not enough freedom for individuals. So the dissolution is actually also something that Marx welcomes to some extent. And so on. So, I mean, this is like learning the Western philosopher, learning from non-Western values. And this is exactly today what I think the global North needs to do. Learning from indigenous knowledge, learning indigenous values, but also learning from the global South. Almost banal example is like brand review, and that kind of things are, often even mentioned by the supporters of capitalism. But we can also utilize those values to really build a new kind of anti-capitalist vision and strategies. And my concern is basically, especially with the eco-modernist vision, is that they tend to ignore the imperial mode of living, and they do not show enough appreciation of those indigenous and also like non-Western values. So in a sense, they are very productivist and Eurocentric. So that's like our remarks. And I think that one reason why come I wanted to reread the late Marx is not simply to show that Marx was always right. Right? I'm not like a dogmatic defender of Marxism or Marx, but I think there are things that we can still truly learn and appreciate in terms of thinking how okay Marx had these problems, and how did he deal with these contradictions and biases in his life. And he is the one who often self-critically reflected on those one-sidedness of his views, and not completely, right? That's also why he never endorsed degrowth communism in his own writings. So this is also me pushing Marx beyond Marx. It's a new interpretation, but I think it's helpful to think about today's divide between degrowth and eco-modernism, between the reds and the greens. And I think this really opens up some kind of post-capitalist imaginary. It's imaginary, so it's not necessarily concrete strategies and proposals. But without those imaginary, we can never think about adequate strategies and proposals, right? So I think I hope that people can learn some new insights and thinking about post-capitalism today.
Great, thank you. Yeah, there are some wonderful ideas and provocations in the book. You get a sense of it, I think, from this discussion, but there's a lot more here too. So I would encourage people to pick up a copy of the book afterwards. And certainly, we can talk more about it. But I did have another question here in the green. Yeah, with the Max.
First of all, I just wanted to make a comment off of the person that was talking about native epistemologies. I think your concept of utilizing Marx's metabolic rift is very much in line with like how native epistemologies view nature, which is almost this like symbiotic relationship where it's like in Potawatomi, I'm aware that they utilize the same pronouns that they use for their family that they would for nature. So it's almost like incorporating it and giving it the same amount of rights that you would to nature. My question was, and I wrote it down because I knew I would forget it. So really, how do you think the ways in which we talk about nature, particularly derived from a Judeo-Christian framework, have influenced the development of capitalism and our current environmental policies, and how significant is the role of these cultural narratives in shaping the rights we give to nature and how they're embedded in our legal and constitutional system?
One more? Yeah, maybe. Yeah. One more? We have another.
Oh, okay, has one?
Right?
Oh, yes. Okay. I guess. Well, first, I haven't yet read the book. I plan to. I guess something that's coming up for me is like the role design plays in all of this, and how we are all sort of trying to navigate systems that have been designed in a way that is rooted in exploitation. And so my question then is, how do we, on a ground level, empower communities, specifically communities of color, to sort of design or redesign systems that work for them, free of exploitation, whether that be the exploitation of other people or nature. Yeah, I guess that would be my question.
Okay, thank you. I think in some sense, that's about also the limitation. It's related to the limitation of Marx, and the Marx is obviously writing in the tradition of the Western society, the Western tradition. So his perception of nature is not obviously identical with the indigenous one, right? And then it's pretty much, in some sense, compatible with today's our conception of nature. It's like modern conception of nature based on natural sciences, and he also, used to advocate some kind of mastery and subjugation of nature to technologies and productive forces. But he became less and less optimistic, and he also self-critically deals with this kind of view. And then that's why he also wanted to learn from non-Western conception of nature and so on. And that doesn't mean that he abandoned, right? So in a sense that my conception, or like my argument of metabolic rift, my conception of some kind of sustainability in degrowth communism is anthropocentric, because it's very hard for us to, at least on a mainstream way, it's very hard to conceptualize sustainability, the issue of sustainability. This is the topic that I argue more in the Marx in the Anthropocene. But this is basically, it's very hard to conceptualize the sustainability without taking an anthropocentric view in a weak sense. It's not like manipulation. Humans are exceptional being and so on. No, it's not. But at the same time, we can only think about the well-being of non-human beings from human perspective. And when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about decarbonization, we always talk those issues in relation to certain level of civilization, right? Why 1.5 degrees Celsius? Because otherwise many people die, especially in Africa and so on. So it's about mainly human issues. And of course, that will also have significant impact on coral reef, and wildfire will destroy biodiversity and so on. So it's not simply about humans, but always in some sense anthropocentric in a weak sense. So that's something I also kind of accept. And then so I don't go enough to, for example, as you said, it's like redistributing the rights to non-human beings and then conceptualize different way of living and so on. So we can debate this. I mean, I think it's necessary in some sense to go beyond that human-centralized, anthropocentric view in dealing with certain issues. But in other issues, it's also necessary to stick to this weak version of anthropocentrism too. That doesn't mean there is always, or there has to be always, a learning process from, especially for the people in the European tradition, to learn from non-Western or indigenous way of thinking, being, and system, and so on. So that's something that I think we should all do, and I'm also doing. In the question of the design, I think I cannot contribute that much because I don't know much about those like communities in the US. Now I live in Japan for many years, but I think it's one thing that I wanted to highlight. Well, there are two things. One is basically even today socialism or socialists are often very kind of top down state and introducing new laws, policies will change the society. I think one of the manifestations is basic income. The other is modern monetary theory. And these are the things that once you have some kind of good government, good leaders, then they will implement those good policies like Green New Deal based on modern monetary theory, including basic income or something. But, you know, these are the things that don't necessarily challenge our imperial mode of living unless you have this process of learning from non-Western values or engaging in those like communal activities. So in a sense, it's very attractive because you just have to vote for those radical candidates, Bernie Sanders of AOC, or they will take care of you with experts. But what I wanted to highlight in this book is actually Marx was quite critical of that kind of top-down transformation, and he was also recognizing the limitation of law or those policies, because actually what's more important is how we act and how we relate to each other in everyday way of life. Even if you have like law against racism, it's not necessarily implemented every day, right? In a social area, working place, and so on. Even if you don't have a law against racism, if your colleagues or your friends are critical of racism, they can create a sphere where racism is problematized and prohibited. So it's not necessarily law that change our way of life. It is our way of thinking and action in everyday life. So in the sense that the community activity is very important. That will change our perception and behavior, and then they are reflected one day to the law and then become new norms, right? So that's the way of the thinking that I think, of course, like for activists, it's kind of obvious, but at the same time, for some socialists or some left wings and liberals, they are often kind of romanticize the power of law and the policies and the government. So I think this kind of more anarchist vision of changing society, establishing new norms and so on, is worth highlighting today.
All right, thank you. So since we all can stay in this room and continue to discuss and talk after, we're going to take a last set of questions from the people joining us online. So I think John's going to share with us maybe a question from our friends. Yeah.
Yeah, so there are a couple. One is a question of whether there are instances where whole societies have changed without deep apocalyptic crises. And then the second one, which I think is a fun one to end on, is please ask Mr. Saitō what he thinks is the most bullshit job capitalism has ever created.
So it's very hard to, even after the experience of the pandemic, and then, many people read my book in Japan, but then after the pandemic, pandemic is kind of over, then people just go back to the normality, and they seem to forget the lessons that they learned. So it's increasingly likely that they will, continue to destroy the planet, and then what humans are doing now, it's just, genocide, and, another war, and so on. So I think humans are really stupid. But at the same time, I think something is changing. Now, this is something that we can never deny or should not forget, because when I was at Wesleyan 2005 until 2009, no one was really talking about class, and no one was talking about socialism, and people were more concerned with other things, issues like identity politics or maybe something like that. But in the last 10 years, there are even US like increasing interest in various kinds of socialist and anti-capitalist ideas, and there are new movements, and they are not enough maybe, and they are not fast enough. So there are many problems and limitations, but I think compared to 10 or like 20 years ago, it really changed, especially younger generations. And I gave the lecture at the U Chicago 2 days ago, and many people are really open to those ideas, degrowth communism. And that's, I think, something changing, right? So, in a sense, I am hoping that more and more people will join in this radical transformation of our society. And I don't think it's, this debate between eco-modernism and degrowth is something that we should be wasting our time and energy by just criticizing each other. I think once we kind of listen to what degrowth communism and what both sides are saying can be reconciled. And I think this is, one thing that I wanted to highlight today. Degrowth is not the negation of technology, going back to nature kind of thing, but we have to be also critical of technologies and our imperial mode of living. I think this is something that many people can agree, right? So I'm hoping that this will really be a basis for a more revolutionary politics before the political crisis become really terrible thing in the coming decades or so. And I don't know about the most bullshit jobs in the history. I want to say something funny, but now I'm kind of a jet lag, and then yeah. But there are. It's also the indication that the people use those vocabulary, bullshit jobs, and it also had this resonance in the last couple of years during the pandemic, and many people came to recognize that no job, in a sense, in capitalism is really non-bullshit jobs. All the jobs are bullshit jobs in a sense. There are different degrees of satisfaction and meaningfulness, but even your job, at least certain percentage, about 40% can be bullshit jobs, right? So I think we are really wasting our life, but also wasting many energy and resources. So this is something we should really be angry, and then this is something that we can change. And shortening working hours is both degrowth, but it's creating a new kind of abundance. So this is not about austerity. And then, if you think in this way, degrowth is not scary. Degrowth is about actually improving your life, sustaining the environment, and enriching the communal ties, and making your life more meaningful. Right?
Thank you so much, Kōhei, for being here, coming all this way, sharing the book, writing the book, sharing the book. If you haven't gotten it, pick up a copy, slow down. Thank you.
Thank you.